My name is Robert Mitchell, and I'm 58 years old. I've spent most of my life believing that love and sacrifice were enough to build an unbreakable bond with your children. I worked construction for 30 years, pouring concrete and sweat into foundations that would last generations. But nothing prepared me for the foundation of my own family crumbling beneath my feet. This past Christmas, my son Michael spoke 6 words that shattered 26 years of fatherhood. As I stood in the dining room I built with my own hands, surrounded by the elegant furniture I saved months to buy, those words echoed off walls that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt unappreciated by family, and don't forget to subscribe because this journey gets incredibly intense and you won't want to miss what happens next. Looking back now, I realize the cracks started forming years before that devastating Christmas dinner, but at the time I thought I was building something beautiful. When my wife Sarah died of cancer, Michael was only 8 years old. I remember sitting in that hospital chair holding her hand as the monitors went silent, knowing that everything would fall on my shoulders now. I had to be both mother and father to a grieving little boy who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. Those early years after Sarah's death were the hardest of my life, but also the most meaningful. I'd wake up at 4:30 every morning, pack Michael's lunch, drive him to school, then head to construction sites where I'd pour concrete or frame houses until dark. Most nights I'd come home covered in sawdust and cement, my back aching, but Michael would be waiting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out. I'd wash my hands and sit beside him helping with math problems, even though my own education never went beyond high school. I gave up everything for that boy. I sold my Harley Davidson, the one thing I owned that was purely mine, just to afford his Little League equipment and fees. I stopped dating entirely because I couldn't bear the thought of some woman thinking Michael was baggage. Every weekend, instead of resting my sore muscles, we'd work on our house together. I taught him how to use a level, how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive a nail without bending it. He had small hands then, but they were eager hands. Room by room, we transformed that modest 3-bedroom ranch into something special. Michael would hold the other end of the measuring tape while I marked studs. He'd hand me screws while I installed drywall. When we finished the hardwood floors in the living room, we both lay down on our backs, staring up at the ceiling fan we'd installed together, our hands stained with polyurethane but our hearts full of accomplishment. I never missed a parent-teacher conference, never skipped a school play, never failed to show up at his baseball games, even when I was working double shifts. The other construction workers used to tease me about rushing off every evening, but I didn't care. Michael was everything to me. He was smart, too smarter than I ever was. His grades were straight A's, and teachers would tell me during conferences how impressed they were with his writing ability, his analytical thinking. When high school guidance counselors started talking about college, my heart swelled with pride and terror in equal measure. Pride because my boy was going places I never could. Terror because I knew I couldn't afford to send him anywhere decent. I started picking up weekend jobs painting houses and installing fence posts, saving every extra dollar. It still wasn't enough for the fancy schools he deserved, but Michael earned a partial scholarship to State University, and I covered the rest with loans that would take me years to pay off. The day he graduated college with his business degree, I sat in those uncomfortable plastic auditorium chairs wearing my best shirt and tie, watching him walk across that stage, and I thought I had succeeded as a father. I thought all those sacrifices, all those missed opportunities, all those lonely nights had paid off. Michael hugged me afterward, introduced me to his professors, and for a moment I felt like I belonged in that world of education and achievement that I'd helped him enter. But things started changing when he met Cheryl during his first year of law school. She came from what people call old money, the kind of family that owned businesses instead of working in them. The first time Michael brought her home for dinner, I could see her taking inventory of our modest furniture, our simple meals, the calluses on my hands. She was polite enough, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of measuring, that made me uncomfortable. I tried to welcome her, tried to show interest in her studies and her family, but every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. She'd correct my grammar in front of Michael, suggesting I might mean something different than what I'd said. When I'd offer to cook my famous barbecue ribs, she'd mention being vegetarian, though I'd later see her eating chicken at restaurants. After Michael graduated law school and married Cheryl, the distance between us grew like a slow-moving cancer that I couldn't quite diagnose. At first, I told myself it was natural. Young couples need space to build their own lives. But the phone calls that used to come every Sunday evening became every other week, then monthly, then only on major holidays. When they bought their first house in Meadowbrook Estates, one of those upscale developments with gates and manicured lawns, I offered to help with any renovation work they might need. I'd built half the custom homes in our county after all. But Michael politely declined, saying they'd hired professionals. The word professionals stung because I'd been building houses since before he was born, but I swallowed my pride and offered to at least come see the place. That invitation never came. Instead, I'd drive by sometimes after work just to catch a glimpse of where my son lived. Their house was beautiful, I'll give them that. Tudor style with perfectly trimmed hedges and a 3-car garage. Sometimes I'd see him in the yard wearing khakis and polo shirts instead of the work clothes we used to share, and I'd think about stopping. But something held me back, some instinct that told me I wouldn't be welcome. The grandchildren arrived 2 years later. First Emma, then Jake 2 years after that. I learned about Emma's birth from a text message that came 3 days late. Had the baby, Emma Rose, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Everyone's healthy. No invitation to the hospital, no request for help, just a notification, like you'd send about a package delivery. I drove to the hospital anyway, bought a teddy bear from the gift shop, and tried to visit. The nurse told me visiting hours were family only, and when she called up to the room, I could hear Cheryl's voice in the background, saying they weren't ready for visitors yet. I left the bear at the nurse's station with a card I'd written 3 times, trying to find words that wouldn't sound desperate. My attempts to stay connected became increasingly pathetic, though I didn't see it that way at the time. I'd send birthday gifts through the mail, expensive toys I couldn't really afford, hoping to earn some space in Emma's affection. I'd call and ask if I could babysit, offering to drive the hour and 15 minutes to their neighborhood anytime they needed help. The answers were always polite variations of no thank you. Cheryl had perfected the art of exclusion disguised as courtesy. When I'd suggest family dinners, she'd mention their busy social calendar. When I'd offer to teach Emma to ride a bike like I'd taught her father, she'd explain they'd enrolled her in professional lessons. Every boundary felt reasonable when presented individually, but together they formed an impenetrable wall. The worst part was watching Michael go along with it all. This was the same boy who used to beg me for just 5 more minutes when I'd tuck him in at night. The same kid who'd climb into my lap during thunderstorms. Now he'd stand behind Cheryl during our brief encounters, nodding along, as she explained why this weekend wouldn't work. Why this invitation couldn't be extended. Why this tradition couldn't continue. I started noticing comments about different social circles and lifestyle compatibility. Cheryl would mention charity galas and country club events, then add apologetically that they just weren't my kind of thing. She wasn't wrong, but the way she said it made those differences feel like moral failings rather than simple preferences. The breaking point came the Thanksgiving, before that terrible Christmas. Michael had called and invited me to dinner, and I'd spent 2 weeks planning what I'd bring, what I'd wear, what stories I might tell about his childhood that would make Emma and Jake laugh. Then 3 days before the holiday, another call came. Cheryl's parents would be joining them unexpectedly, and the table would be too crowded. Perhaps we could get together the following weekend instead. The following weekend never came. My neighbor Gloria found me sitting on my porch that Thanksgiving evening, eating a turkey sandwich and watching the sunset. She's a widow too, lost her husband to a heart attack 5 years back, and she has a way of understanding sadness without needing explanations. She brought over leftover pie and sat with me in comfortable silence until I finally told her what had happened. "Some people," she said, cutting us each another slice of pumpkin pie, "get so focused on where they're going that they forget where they came from. But that doesn't mean where they came from stops being important." I held on to those words like a life preserver, but the drowning feeling was getting stronger every day. The phone call came on December 20th, completely unexpected. Michael's voice sounded different, more formal than usual, but I was so grateful to hear from him that I didn't pay attention to the warning signs. "Dad, we'd like you to join us for Christmas dinner this year. Cheryl's parents will be visiting, and we thought it would be nice to have everyone together." Everyone together. The words lit up something inside me that I'd thought had died during that lonely Thanksgiving. Maybe I'd been too pessimistic. Maybe Cheryl was finally ready to include me in their lives. Maybe becoming a mother had softened her toward family relationships. I spent the next 5 days in a frenzy of preparation that probably should have embarrassed me, but I was too excited to care. I drove to 3 different wine shops looking for the perfect bottle, finally settling on a $47 Cabernet that the clerk assured me would impress sophisticated palates. I bought a new shirt and tie, got my hair cut, even splurged on aftershave. The gifts took the most thought. For Emma, who was 7 now, I found a beautiful dollhouse kit that we could build together just like her father and I used to build things. For Jake, who'd just turned 5, I picked out a set of child-safe tools with his name engraved on the handles. For Michael and Cheryl, I chose a framed photograph I'd had restored showing 3 generations of the Mitchell family at a barbecue from years past, back when family gatherings felt natural and unforced. Christmas morning, I decorated my own house with more enthusiasm than I'd felt in years. I hung garlands, set up the tree we'd bought together when Michael was 12, and even played Christmas music while I got dressed. If the dinner went well, maybe they'd come back here afterward. Maybe the grandchildren would want to see the workshop where their father had learned to use tools. Maybe this was the beginning of healing. The drive to Meadowbrook Estates took longer than usual because of Christmas traffic, but I didn't mind. I used the time to practice conversations, thinking of questions. I could ask Cheryl's parents stories I could tell about Michael's childhood that wouldn't embarrass him in front of his in-laws. Their house looked like something from a magazine with professional holiday decorations and lights that must have cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I parked behind a silver Mercedes that I assumed belonged to Cheryl's parents, checked my appearance one more time in the rearview mirror, and walked up the stone pathway, carrying my carefully chosen gifts. Cheryl answered the door wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than I made in a week. Her smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. "Robert, thank you for coming. Everyone's in the living room." She didn't call me Dad, didn't take my coat, didn't compliment my appearance or acknowledge the gifts I was carrying. The living room was full of people I didn't recognize. Cheryl's parents, Richard and Patricia, stood near the fireplace holding crystal glasses and discussing something in low, cultured voices. Michael wore a suit and tie, looking like a stranger in my son's body. Emma and Jake sat quietly on the sofa, dressed like miniature adults, nothing like the energetic children I remembered from my few brief visits. The introductions were painfully formal. Richard shook my hand with the grip of someone who'd never done manual labor, asking about my profession, in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer and found it amusing. Patricia smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes, complimenting my nice shirt in a way that somehow felt condescending. I presented the gifts I'd chosen so carefully, watching as Emma opened the dollhouse kit with polite disinterest, and Jake examined his engraved tools like they were foreign objects. My restored family photograph earned a brief "how thoughtful" from Cheryl before being set aside without further comment. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed golf tournaments and charity events, vacation homes and private schools, investment portfolios and country club politics. When I tried to contribute, my comments landed with hollow thuds that echoed in brief, uncomfortable silences before someone smoothly changed the subject. I started to realize that I hadn't been invited to join their Christmas dinner. I'd been invited to witness their Christmas performance, to play the role of the simple, grateful father who would admire their success and then quietly disappear back to his modest life. But I didn't understand yet just how cruel this performance was about to become. The dining room table was set like something from a fancy restaurant, with more forks than I knew what to do with, and wine glasses that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. I found myself seated between Emma and an empty chair directly across from Richard, who seemed determined to interview me about my background. "So Robert Michael tells us you work in construction." He began cutting his prime rib with surgical precision. "That must be satisfying work." The pause before "satisfying" contained volumes of judgment. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been building houses for 30 years. Put myself through some tough times, but it let me provide for Michael after my wife passed." "How admirable," Patricia added, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. "Manual labor can be so authentic." And the word authentic dripped with condescension, but I forced myself to smile. These were Michael's family now, and I wanted to make a good impression. I tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "Michael was always good with his hands when he was younger. We built most of our house together, didn't we, son?" Michael looked up from his plate, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Embarrassment, maybe, or annoyance. "That was a long time ago, Dad." "Dad." The word sounded foreign coming from his mouth, like he was trying out a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Richard leaned forward with renewed interest. "Family heritage is so important. Don't you think Patricia and I were just telling the children about their great-grandfather's shipping business, built from nothing into a regional empire? What did your father do, Robert?" The question felt like stepping onto thin ice. "He worked the steel mills in Pittsburgh. Died when I was 16. "How tragic," Patricia murmured, though she sounded more curious than sympathetic. "And your mother?" "Worked as a seamstress. Took in laundry to make ends meet." The silence that followed was different from the earlier uncomfortable pauses. This one had weight to it, like the moment before a building collapses. I could feel Emma looking up at me with something that might have been interest, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her all evening. "Grandpa Robert," she said suddenly, "Daddy says you taught him how to build things." My heart jumped at hearing her call me Grandpa, the first time either child had acknowledged our relationship. "That's right, sweetheart. Your daddy was the best little helper I ever had. He could hand me nails faster than most grown men." But instead of the warm smile I expected from Michael, his expression darkened. He glanced at Cheryl, then at her parents, then back at his plate. "Emma, finish your dinner." "But I want to hear about, Emma." Michael's voice carried a warning that silenced her immediately. Richard cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. It's wonderful when families maintain their traditions. Of course, as circumstances change, sometimes we have to adapt our social connections to reflect our current status. I didn't understand what he meant, but something cold was forming in the pit of my stomach. I'm sorry. Patricia set down her wine glass and smiled that razor-sharp smile again. What Richard means is that families evolve, people grow. Sometimes that growth requires making difficult choices about which relationships serve our best interests. The room felt like it was shrinking around me. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. Cheryl was studying her manicured nails. Even the children seemed to sense something terrible approaching. I don't understand, I said, though part of me was beginning to. Michael finally looked up and his face was a stranger's face. Cold, decided, final. Dad, this is hard to say, but Cheryl and I have made some decisions about our family's direction. We've worked very hard to build a certain kind of life, and we need to surround ourselves with people who complement that life. The words were coming too fast and not fast enough. I could hear them, but they weren't making sense, like listening to someone speak underwater. We've told our friends and colleagues that you passed away 2 years ago. Michael continued, his voice gaining strength from Patricia's approving nods. It's easier that way. Less complicated. The world tilted sideways. What? You are no longer our family. He said the words precise and sharp as scalpel cuts. We have passed. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children had stopped eating. Emma's eyes were wide with confusion, and Jake was looking back and forth between his father and me like he was watching a tennis match he didn't understand. Michael, I whispered, my voice barely working. What are you saying? I'm saying that this lifestyle, this image we've built, it requires certain sacrifices. You don't fit into the world we live in now. Your background, your job, your education level. It's embarrassing. When people ask about family, it's just easier to say, my father is deceased. Richard nodded approvingly. Sometimes we must choose between sentiment and success. The children understand, Cheryl added smoothly. We've explained that Grandpa Robert was never really part of the family. Just a family friend who's been visiting less and less. I looked at Emma and Jake, seeing the confusion in their young faces, and something inside me shattered so completely that I could almost hear the sound it made. You told them I was dead? I said, not really a question. Functionally, yes, Michael replied. This dinner was meant to be a final goodbye, a chance for closure before we move on permanently. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking to the door. I only remember the sound of expensive china clinking against silverware as they resumed eating behind me, and Emma's small voice asking, Daddy, why is Grandpa Robert crying? The last thing I heard as I walked out into the cold Christmas night was Michael's voice, calm and controlled. Finish your vegetables, sweetheart. And remember, his name isn't Grandpa Robert. He's just Robert. The drive home was a blur of Christmas lights and tears I couldn't stop. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a long time, staring at my house with all its hopeful decorations glowing in the windows. The tree I'd set up for grandchildren who would never see it. The cookies I'd baked for a family that had legally erased me from existence. Inside, the silence was deafening. I walked through rooms I'd built with my own hands, past photographs of Michael at every age, past the workshop, where I'd taught him to use tools, past the bedroom, where I'd rocked him back to sleep after nightmares about his mother. None of it mattered anymore. According to my son, I'd been dead for 2 years. I didn't eat for 3 days, didn't shower, didn't answer the phone when Gloria called to check on me. I just sat in my recliner staring at the Christmas tree and trying to understand how 26 years of love could be erased with a dinner invitation and a few cruel sentences. The legal papers arrived on New Year's Day, delivered by certified mail, like a final insult. Michael had filed documents to legally change his name from Mitchell to Harrison Sherrill's maiden name. He'd also petitioned to have all records of his original birth certificate sealed effectively, orphaning himself by choice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later, when Gloria knocked on my door with a concerned expression and a printout from Facebook. "Robert, honey, I think you need to see this." The post was from Michael's account, a family photo from Christmas dinner with a long caption about honoring family traditions and grateful for the love and guidance of our parents. The comments were full of sympathy from friends and colleagues who knew his father had passed away several years ago, and admiration for how well he'd overcome that difficult childhood. Gloria showed me more. Comments on Cheryl's social media about growing up essentially fatherless and how they were breaking cycles of dysfunction for their own children. Posts about the importance of choosing family and not being held back by circumstances of birth. They weren't just erasing me. They were rewriting history, turning my love and sacrifice into abandonment and dysfunction. Michael was telling people I'd been an absent father, that he'd raised himself, that his success came despite his unfortunate background, rather than because of my support. I locked myself in the house for 2 weeks, letting my beard grow and my bills pile up. I couldn't eat without thinking about that Christmas dinner. I couldn't sleep without hearing Michael's voice saying, "You are no longer our family." I couldn't look at photographs without wondering if my entire life had been a delusion. The turning point came when my old friend Marlene showed up unannounced on a Friday evening with a pot of chili and a no-nonsense attitude. Marlene had known us since Michael was 10, had watched me struggle through those early years after Sarah died, had seen me at school plays and baseball games and graduation ceremonies. "Robert Mitchell," she said, pushing past me into the living room. "This is enough. You look like hell, your yard looks like hell, and I'm tired of watching you disappear because some ungrateful boy decided to play pretend with his life." I tried to explain what Michael had said, how I'd failed as a father, how maybe I really was an embarrassment to their new life. But Marlene cut me off with a wave of her hand. "That boy had the best father I ever saw. You think I don't remember you working 3 jobs to pay for his baseball equipment? You think I forgot about you learning algebra at night so you could help him with homework? You think nobody noticed you wearing the same 3 shirts for 2 years because every extra dollar went to his college fund?" She made me sit down and eat while she told me stories I'd forgotten. About the time Michael broke his arm and I slept in a hospital chair for 3 days. About parent-teacher conferences where his teachers praised not just his intelligence, but his character, his kindness, his work ethic. About graduation day, when he couldn't stop thanking me in front of everyone for giving him everything. "That man who spoke to you at Christmas," Marlene said firmly, "that wasn't your son. That was fear talking. Fear that he doesn't deserve what he has. Fear that people will judge him for coming from humble beginnings. Fear that he's not good enough for that fancy life he's built." As she spoke, something began shifting inside me. Not healing, not yet, but a kind of clarity. Michael's cruelty wasn't about my failures as a father. It was about his own insecurities, his desperate need to belong in a world that valued pedigree over character. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me understand that this wasn't really about me at all. The path back to myself wasn't straight or simple, but it started with a decision to stop hiding. If Michael wanted to pretend I was dead, that was his choice. But I wasn't going to live like a ghost in my own life. I started small, showered, shaved, answered Gloria's calls, went back to work part-time with my old construction crew, who welcomed me back with the kind of loyalty that only comes from years of shared labor and mutual respect. When they asked where I'd been, I told them the truth. Not the details, but the basics. My son and I weren't speaking. Family troubles. It happens. What I discovered was that most people understood family pain in ways I hadn't expected. Joe, my old foreman, told me about his daughter who'd moved to California and hadn't called in 3 years. Maria, who worked in the office, shared how her brother had cut contact with their whole family over money. Pain like this wasn't rare or shameful. It was human. 3 months after that terrible Christmas, I was installing cabinets in a kitchen renovation when the homeowner mentioned she knew my son. Michael Harrison, right? He handled the legal work for our real estate purchase. Small world. My hands kept working, but my mind went very still. How do you know he's my son? Oh, he mentioned his father was a contractor. Said you'd taught him everything he knew about construction, but that you'd passed away a few years back. He seemed really broken up about it. I finished installing that cabinet with steady hands, but inside something was crystallizing. Michael wasn't just telling people I was dead to avoid embarrassment. He was using my death as a sympathy tool, a way to generate emotional connection with clients and colleagues. My imaginary passing had become part of his professional persona. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Christmas. I drove past their house. The for sale sign in the front yard was a shock. I pulled over and called a realtor friend to ask about the listing. The house was in pre-foreclosure. Michael and Cheryl were 3 months behind on mortgage payments and facing imminent eviction. More investigation revealed a pattern of financial overextension that explained everything. The expensive cars were leased. The country club membership was financed. Michael's law practice was struggling because he'd been so focused on image over substance-taking cases that looked prestigious, but paid poorly, joining organizations that drained money instead of generating it. They'd built a house of cards, and it was starting to collapse. I could have felt satisfaction at their downfall, but instead I felt sad. This was the life Michael had chosen over family, and it was crumbling around him, just like my heart had crumbled that Christmas night. But I also felt something else. Possibility. I contacted Emma and Jake's school district and made anonymous donations to their educational funds. Not enough to be traced back to me, but enough to ensure they'd have opportunities regardless of their parents' financial situation. I also set up trust funds in their names to be accessed when they turned 18, with one condition: they would receive letters I'd written explaining the truth about their family history. Then I did something that surprised even me. I started volunteering at the community center, working with kids whose fathers were absent for various reasons. Some were deployed military, some were working multiple jobs, some were simply gone. These children needed male role models, and I needed to remember what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than judged for what I lacked. The volunteer work led to a newspaper feature about my mentorship program. The reporter was interested in my background, my story of raising a son alone after my wife's death, my philosophy about guiding young people. The article ran with a photograph of me teaching a group of kids how to build birdhouses, and it sparked something I hadn't expected. People started recognizing me around town, not as Michael Harrison's embarrassing father, but as that man who helps kids at the community center. Former clients called to thank me for work I'd done on their homes years earlier. Parents stopped me in grocery stores to tell me how much their children enjoyed my woodworking classes. I was becoming visible again, not as someone defined by my son's rejection, but as someone valuable in my own right. The respect I received was earned through my actions, not inherited through family connections, and it felt more solid than anything I'd ever experienced. 6 months after Christmas, I ran into Cheryl at the bank. She looked tired, stressed, nothing like the polished woman who'd dismissed me from her dining room. She saw me and froze, clearly debating whether to acknowledge my existence. I made the choice for her. "Hello, Cheryl. I hope you and the children are doing well." She stared at me for a moment, then said quietly, "We're managing." I nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. If Emma or Jake ever want to learn about their grandfather, about their father's childhood, they're welcome to call me. No judgment, no drama, just family stories. She didn't respond, but I saw something shift in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding that some bridges don't have to stay burned forever. 2 years after that devastating Christmas dinner, my life had taken on a rhythm I never could have imagined. The mentorship program had grown into something bigger than I'd planned, with 3 other volunteers and a waiting list of children who wanted to learn practical skills. We built everything from simple shelves to elaborate playhouses, but more importantly, we built confidence and connection. I was teaching a group of kids how to use a drill press on a Thursday afternoon when I noticed a small figure watching from the doorway. Emma, now 9 years old, hung back like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. She'd grown taller, but she still had those serious eyes that reminded me so much of her father at that age. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" I asked, setting down my tools and walking over to her. "Are you really my grandpa?" she asked without preamble, the way children do when they've been thinking about something for a long time. My heart clenched, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you think?" She reached into her backpack and pulled out a photograph creased from being folded and unfolded many times. It was the family picture I'd brought to Christmas dinner 2 years ago, the one that had been set aside without comment. Somehow she'd rescued it. "Daddy looks happy here," she said, studying the image. "He looks like the kids in your workshop." I knelt down so we were eye level. "Your daddy was about your age in that picture. We were building a tree house in the backyard." "Did he really help you build houses?" "He was my best helper for years. Handed me tools, measured boards, helped me paint. We were a good team." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information against whatever she'd been told at home. "Why did Daddy say you weren't family anymore?" The question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. I chose my words carefully, knowing that whatever I said would shape how she understood not just me, but her father. Sometimes people get scared that they're not good enough for the life they want. Your daddy worked very hard to become successful, and sometimes when people work that hard, they worry that their past might hold them back. It doesn't excuse hurtful choices, but it might explain them. "Are you dead?" The blunt question from a 9-year-old made me smile despite everything. "Do I seem dead to you?" She giggled, the first genuine laughter I'd heard from her since she was tiny. "No. Dead people can't use drill presses." That afternoon, Emma stayed for the entire workshop session, learning how to sand wood smooth and listening to stories about her father's childhood. I was careful not to criticize Michael or Cheryl, but I also didn't hide the truth about our relationship. She was smart enough to fill in the gaps herself. When her ride arrived, it wasn't Cheryl or Michael. It was a babysitter, a tired-looking teenager who barely looked up from her phone. Emma hugged me goodbye and whispered, "Can I come back next week?" "If your parents say it's okay." She nodded solemnly and started toward the car, then turned back. "Grandpa Robert, I'm glad you're not really dead." Emma started coming to the workshop regularly, always with different caregivers, never with her parents. A month later, Jake joined her, shy at first, but quickly warming up to the activities and attention. Like his sister, he was hungry for the kind of steady, unconditional love that I'd spent years learning how to give. I was careful never to put the children in the middle of the adult conflict. When they asked questions about their father, I told them truthful stories that emphasized his good qualities. When they mentioned their parents' stress about money or arguments they'd overheard, I listened without judgment or commentary. My goal was to be a source of stability and love, not to undermine their parents or win some kind of loyalty contest. But I could see the effect of the family tension on both children. Emma was anxious perfectionist, desperate to please everyone around her. Jake was withdrawn, acting younger than his 7 years, still sucking his thumb when he thought no one was looking. They needed what I could offer: unconditional acceptance, patient guidance, and the security of knowing that at least one adult in their lives would never abandon them. The confrontation I'd been expecting finally came on a cold February evening. I was locking up the community center when I saw Michael's car in the parking lot. He got out slowly, like a man walking toward an execution, and for a moment he looked so much like the uncertain boy I'd raised that my heart ached. Dad. The word came out rusty, like he hadn't used it in a long time. Michael. We stood there in the parking lot, two men who shared 26 years of history and 2 years of silence, neither knowing how to bridge the gap between us. I know Emma and Jake have been coming here, he said finally. They have. Cheryl's parents think we should forbid it. They say it's confusing for the children. I waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. But Emma seems happier, and Jake is talking more. They both keep mentioning things you've taught them. He looked up at the community center building with its simple brick exterior and hand-painted sign. This is good work you're doing here. It's needed work. Michael nodded, then took a deep breath like he was preparing to dive into cold water. I owe you an apology. What I said at Christmas, the way I said it. That was wrong. Cruel. Yes, it was. He flinched at my directness, but I wasn't going to make this easy for him. He'd made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. I was scared, he continued. Scared that people would judge me, judge us, if they knew about where I came from. You came from love, Michael. You came from sacrifice and hard work and someone who believed in you completely. If that's something to be ashamed of, then I don't understand the world anymore. He was crying now, not dramatically, but with the quiet, helpless tears of someone who'd lost something precious through their own actions. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if you can fix this, I said honestly. But you can stop making it worse. You can stop lying about me being dead. You can stop rewriting history to make yourself look like a victim. And you can decide whether you want your children to know their grandfather or grow up thinking family is something disposable when it becomes inconvenient. We talked for another hour in that cold parking lot, not finding forgiveness, but maybe finding the beginning of understanding. Michael admitted that his marriage was struggling, that the financial pressure was overwhelming, that he'd built a life he couldn't actually afford to maintain. He also admitted that watching Emma and Jake light up when they talked about their time with me had forced him to confront what he'd thrown away. I didn't offer to help with money. I didn't offer to reconcile immediately. But I did offer something more valuable. I offered to keep being the grandfather his children needed, regardless of what he decided about our relationship. They love you, he said, as we prepared to leave. Emma keeps that old family photo in her backpack, and Jake built a birdhouse in your workshop that he won't let Cheryl throw away. I love them too. That's what family does. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then I remember building that treehouse with you. Best summer of my childhood. Mine too. He drove away without making any promises, but something had shifted between us. Not healing, not yet, but maybe the possibility of healing somewhere down the road. Christmas came around again, and this time I was ready for it. Instead of hoping for invitations that wouldn't come, I organized a holiday party at the community center for all the kids in my program and their families. Emma and Jake attended with their babysitter, bringing homemade cookies and staying until the very end. As I watched them help clean up, laughing with the other children and calling me Grandpa Robert, where everyone could hear, I realized that family isn't just about blood or legal documents or social approval. Family is about showing up day after day, year after year, with love that doesn't depend on perfect behavior or convenient circumstances. I'd lost a son, at least temporarily. But I'd gained something too, the knowledge that my worth as a person and as a father wasn't determined by one person's cruel words, even if that person was the child I'd raised. I was still the man who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for baseball equipment. I was still the father who'd slept in hospital chairs and learned algebra at night. I was still the grandfather who could teach children how to build birdhouses and believe in themselves. Some foundations crumble under pressure. Others prove their strength by surviving earthquakes. Mine was still standing, and there was room on it for anyone who wanted to build something lasting and true. Looking back now, I realize that Christmas dinner 2 years ago wasn't the end of my family story. It was just the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter where I got to choose my own worth instead of having it assigned by someone else's fears and insecurities. And in this new chapter, I was very much alive. What would you do if someone you loved tried to erase you from their life completely? Have you ever had to rebuild your sense of worth after a devastating rejection? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched something in your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding dignity in difficult times. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's approval, even when those people are family. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the family that chooses you is more valuable than the family you were born into. Until next time, keep building something beautiful with your life.